Are you a podcaster? Maybe you've got that big idea and you're looking for a network to join. The multi-award-winning Ozcast Network can get your content to eyes and ears all over the world. Join now for the first month free, and you could be featuring this sound at the beginning of your podcast. Ozcast. Simply head to ozcastnetwork.com for details.
I even love the smell of books. Hi, welcome to Sundoku. This is the podcast for anyone who can't say no to another book. I'm Annie Hastwell.
And I'm Kath Keneally. And if you didn't study Japanese, well, neither did we, but we couldn't resist the single word that sums up one great idea.
It's the word you can apply to that teetering pile of books beside your bed. You know, the one you promise yourself you'll get around to reading sometime. Give me an idea what's in your Sundoku, Kath.
Okay, well, my Sundoku pile teetered over and it's now living in a big basket by the bedside table. But the three that are alongside the bed are a book that my daughter gave me called The Flat Chair by Beth O'Leary that I've started and I'm really loving. I'm reading Mr. Bridge by Evan S. Connell, which is the follow-up to Mrs. Bridge that one of my book groups just read. It's a classic from 1956, the Mrs. Bridge. And Mr. Bridge, kind of the response came out 10 years later. And they were both made into a fabulous film with Paul Newman and Joanne Woodward. That was quite amazing, but I'm loving that, or at least I think I will. I'll be rereading it. And the other thing I picked up from a bookshop is by apparently a new rising star of Copenhagen literary fiction. It's called The Tenant, and she is Katrina Engelberg.
Right. Oh, you make me feel very lowbrow next to my bed, all sorts of things. I've got some old John Wyndham that I'm planning to get into because I read The Kraken Wakes again last year.
Yeah.
Was amazed by how much it could be applied to the current day.
Yeah.
I've got huge piles of New Yorkers everywhere. Usually have a poetry book or two. Mm-hmm. But there is one book, which is a new book, which I'm planning to read, and that is a book called Sweetness and Light, which is set in India, in the sort of hippie areas where all the hippies go to in India, by Liam Pepper. So that's the next one on the list. And one of the fantastic things, I guess, why I go for books like that too, is that it takes you on adventures to any part of the world that you might have been to or that you might want to go to. Travel writers get to do that all the time. And today, later on, we'll talk to one who likes to follow in the footsteps of adventurers of the past.
It's almost like travelling in the fourth dimension. When you've got a book in your backpack, you kind of experience it in the pages, and then you actually find your feet on the ground. It's really an unusual place to be.
But first, Annie, I gather you've been speaking to one of the rising stars of Australian writing.
Yes, Emily Bitto has written a memorable road story called Wild Abandon about a young, innocent Australian man called Will who goes off to America to escape his small-town roots.
He first lands in New York, where he goes on what could only really be described as an epic bender. And then through, strange sort of circumstances, he ends up in the Midwest, in Ohio, living and working in a private zoo owned by a sort of troubled Vietnam veteran called Wayne. And then things get darker from there, basically.
It has a very heart of darkness feel about it too. Some people have likened it to following the end trail of capitalism.
Yeah, I mean, that's a big part of what I was interested in writing about. It's very different from my first novel, which was a historical novel, and this is, pretty contemporary. It's set in 2011, but I really wanted to write about, the strange period that we're living through now in, the sort of what I can only assume are the end days of capitalism. I was just very compelled to sort of think through the strangeness of the world that we live in, and
One of the things that struck me about it was how incredibly vivid the descriptions of America were, both the New York, which is mainly about drugs, and very high-end silly food, you could call it, and then the Midwest, where you've got the very opposite. You've got, once again, fast food, but much more basic drugs and a lot of beer drunk, that sort of thing. What was it about America that you wanted to say by highlighting with description those things?
It is about America, but it's about the relationship that an Australian traveller has with America. And I think part of what I was interested in is the fact that, you know, I've sort of observed that America has sort of become the destination that a lot of young people sort of want to travel to as their first overseas destination. And I'm, you know, in my early 40s, and it's something that I noticed as a change when I first left school and, you know, started travelling. It was more Europe that was the kind of destination. So I was really interested in that, the idea that, you know, America's sort of really become the cultural centre, I think, for young Australians first going out into the world. I'm not sort of purporting to be creating some sort of definitive picture of America or anything like that. It's more about the fantasy of the other place, which in this case happens to be America. But then I think also America fascinates me because of the fact that it is the sort of, you know, the place where capitalism is at its absolute sort of zenith, and that's what we, you know, take on here and try and emulate a lot of the time. And it is a fascinating culture, just the absolute sort of plenitude of things. And, you know, as you sort of gestured, I used a lot of food and drugs and things like that because it's, you know, they are the products of excess, I think, in that environment.
Your book is set against the growing realisation of inequality, which probably started with the GFC. And dear innocent Will finds himself at an art opening in New York. And there's one particular artwork that kind of sums up how silly that world has become, but at the same time how it's underpinned by sort of the moral concerns of the time. So I'm talking about Julia's pile of dust. Can you talk about that particular scene?
Yeah, so this is an art piece that I sort of concocted in my head. Essentially what it is that the artist has taken a sort of cash in hand, low paying job posing as a domestic cleaner for a very wealthy couple, and over a period of 6 months, you know, for very, very low pay, she's cleaned their house and she's collected all of the dust that she's vacuumed off their floor, and then exhibited that in a gallery space alongside a sort of small wad of cash, or images of the small wad of cash that she was paid. So it's, yeah, obviously sort of gesturing to those ideas of, you know, labour and exchange, and, you know, then in the context of the gallery, what is the value of that dust as opposed to on the floor of someone's apartment. Yeah, all of those sort of questions.
And poor Will, you know, he's really out of his depth at this particular party. He tries, you know, to see little things within the pile of dust. He tries to sort of convince himself at that point, although he's not that good at convincing himself, that there is artistic value in what he's looking at.
You know, he desperately wants to be cool, Will. I think he's also high potentially at that point. And, you know, he desperately wants, I think, to have the sort of epiphany that, you know, is probably the unstated aim of a lot of travel, I think. You know, I guess I was sort of poking fun at him slightly at that moment, but I do think that, you know, there's something in that I find really interesting, the idea of what we're looking for when we travel, and how we're sort of desperately searching for those moments of sort of profundity and epiphany, and he's really, really, really trying to get there.
And his background worries him greatly. He's basically rejected his own background. Can you talk a little bit about where he comes from and why he has this great problem in his mind about trying to reject his past and his parents?
Yeah, so he's a sort of country town boy, comes from a quite conservative religious family, or his mother's very religious. He's moved to Melbourne to study, but yeah, he's very, very sort of self-conscious, absolutely sort of hobbled by cultural cringe. And I guess, you know, in that way, he kind of might represent some sort of Australian type. Yeah, and I mean, you know, I grew up actually in a small town for some of my teen years, and I sort of experienced that feeling myself when I, you know, moved to Melbourne, and just had that kind of realisation that, you know, you're not educated in the same sort of cultural capital that kids around you have, and suddenly you feel incredibly unprepared and inadequate, and have to quickly go about sort of trying to obtain that cultural capital. Yeah.
Now, he goes from the New York's, the highs of drugs and the excitement of the art world there, and he goes to the Midwest, where he has a connection to his own country town, the one that he would so like to forget about.
He basically runs out of money, and the only other person he knows in the US is a girl from his hometown called Tamsin that went to his high school. And, he sort of very reluctantly makes contact and goes and stays with her, just really hoping to have a couple of nights free accommodation and maybe try and find some way to scrape together some more money to continue his travels. He lands in this small town in Ohio that really forces him to kind of think about his own hometown, and he's quite scornful as well of Tamsin, because she's sort of moved from one small town to another on the other side of the world. But she's actually really happy about that, and it sort of reveals that his social climbing is not necessarily something that's making him happier.
The book gets much darker and more dramatic at that point, and I believe you were inspired by some real events that happened in America back in 2010.
Yeah, so the initial spark for the novel really was a news story that I saw without giving too many hints. It was about a guy in Ohio that had a private zoo of an absolutely inconceivable number of wild animals, including tigers, lions, bears, and I just couldn't believe that this was actually legal.
And apparently it is in Ohio.
Yeah, well, they've actually changed the laws now since then because of, essentially what happened in that case. But at that time, it was completely legal, and people could just have a tiger in their backyard and no one really needed to know about it, as long as you weren't charging fees for exhibiting them or breeding them or transporting them across state lines. That was completely legal. And I read somewhere that it was estimated that there were more tigers in American homes and backyards than there were in the wild at a particular point. And it just struck me as, a sort of terrible symbol of something, a lot of things really, about the kind of time that we live in, our relationship as humans with the natural world, something about our sort of longing for contact with a sort of certain wildness. And all of those ideas, I guess, were just swirling around in my head after reading that story and doing some sort of digging into that topic. And it just seemed to me such a sort of fertile image and so tragic as well. So that was what got me started.
Will himself, what was it like writing Will? Where did Will come from as your main character?
So I co-own a bar in Melbourne, and I was working with a lot of young Australian guys. I guess I just sort of felt like I had this privileged sort of moment of working a lot in the bar and sort of being able to come into contact with a lot of young Aussie guys and bear witness to the way that they interacted with each other, the way that they sort of thought and spoke, and their hopes and dreams and personalities. And it felt like that allowed me to feel like I could sort of create my own character. Obviously, as I said, I didn't feel like I could write the American story from an insider perspective, so I sort of needed an outsider figure. And then I sort of became really interested in the idea of the young man's quest, which is a very ancient, long-standing sort of narrative trope, and again linking back to those ideas about America as the place that a lot of young men want to travel to, ideas about travel itself, all of those, so many sort of threads that tied together. Yeah,
it has a lot to say about the male psyche, really.
Yeah, it does. I hope that I've done okay.
Well, you'd know by now, wouldn't you? Have you had any reaction?
Yeah, I actually have had really good responses from young men, sometimes kind of gratifyingly for me, but, saying this is very much like the inside of my mind, and it was quite confronting to read. That's, that was very pleasing to hear that.
And taking it to the extreme of the character Wayne, who's a Vietnam vet, so that kind of moves it into the realm of men and war as well, which has also a lot to do with the male psyche.
Yeah, and again, that sort of relates to that idea of, the male initiatory experience that, in times of war, that's what young men kind of go through, and it's very much sort of seen as something that initiates them into adulthood, but obviously it also creates all sorts of long-term impacts that, are not often acknowledged, or particularly weren't, I guess, with Vietnam vets for a long time. And then opposed to that is, who is kind of very aware that he's living a pretty soft, privileged life, and yet there's still a drive to sort of, go on a journey, and he hopes to sort of find something in that will allow him to come back a man in some ways, even though he'd be really embarrassed, I think, to actually say that aloud. There is a need in both young men and young women to sort of seek those initiatory experiences, to look for something that will change us, and then I'm also really interested in sort of narrative form and narrative tropes, and in a way sort of pushing back against that, because there's a cliche that the character must change and grow in a novel, and that's exactly what Will wants out of his journey, but I think it's not really realistic to expect either in a novel or in a road trip that you are going to be able to reach the end a completely transformed person. So I was interested in that too, the fantasy of sort of transformation. Yeah.
There's a wonderful quote from Wayne about the road and what the road is compared to where you are is, and why roads aren't the same as places. Can you kind of sum that up?
Yeah, so Wayne basically offers Will work in his zoo because he needs some help, because the guy that's been helping him out is about to have a baby. And Will's quite hesitant because he has in his mind this idea that he's going on a road trip, and he doesn't want to sort of, I think as he says, get stalled in one place. And then Wayne sort of gives him a bit of a lecture, because Wayne is a character that really likes to sort of dispense wisdom. But I think there is something to what he says, which is essentially that, you can just endlessly be on the road, and the road is not a place, and you learn more in life by getting to know a place intimately than you do by just moving on and moving on.
Emily Bitto, author of Wild Abandon, a book that gives a real sense of travelling in America and the incredible contrast that country offers.
Yes, so often America is used as a backdrop for road stories like Robin Strayed's Wild, Jack Kerouac's On the Road, Hunter S. Thompson, Fear and Loathing in Las Vegas, as well as many, many more.
Absolutely, and reading this last book by Emily Bitto made me think it would be wonderful to be a travel writer. So I tracked down one, writer Max Anderson, to find out what he likes to read.
I need to confess I steer clear of classic travel writing. I find it unedifying, to be quite honest, which is a dreadful hypocrisy, because of course it's the genre that I'm involved with. When I'm travelling, I do tend to read non-fiction. I love my history. I also love any fiction with a tremendous sense of place. And while I'm travelling, sometimes on purpose and sometimes by accident, I find myself travelling in lockstep with a book, and the two things kind of feed off each other.
We're sitting in front of a fascinating pile of books. Can you take me through some of those and where they have taken you?
I can. I would start probably with, there's a book here called The Making of the Atomic Bomb by Richard Rhodes. It's a seminal work on, as the title says. Oddly enough, I hopped into that book when I was travelling to New Mexico to see where they originally tested the gadget, which was Oppenheimer's baby that was tested in the deserts of New Mexico in 1945. Oddly enough, I found myself travelling further on the back of this book, and I almost traced the journey of the bomb, which sounds a bit grim. I went to the island where they loaded the bomb into the B-52, and I also then went to Hiroshima where of course it had its devastating effects.
With this book in hand, was this book a key part of that journey?
Those journeys were taken on different times, but it was always somehow referencing back to the book. I do tend to get a bit obsessive about these books. Another good example is Washing of the Spears, which was the history of the Anglo-Boer and Anglo-Zulu wars of the late 19th century. And again, found myself going to sites, battlefields. This is all pointing to a terrible direction, isn't it? I'm not war obsessed, and I'm not, I'm not one of these ghouls that sort of does war tourism at all. But the connection with the history, I remember going to Blood River, which is a monument. It was built by the South African Boers, and it's a ring of bronze wagons, and to be standing there and reflecting on the particular history, it just gives me goosebumps. And look, it brings together travel, place, time, and I think I've referenced it. It's almost like traveling in the fourth dimension. When you've got a book in your backpack, you kind of experience it in the pages, and then you actually find your feet on the ground. It's really an unusual place to be.
What are the qualities that these authors bring to their work that makes that experience so rich for you, obviously in comparison to your average travel writer?
Look, I love pace. I love writers with pace, which may be why I resist travel writing, because I often find it without pace. Classic travel writing books have an awful lot of ego, have an awful lot of self-reflection, and to some extent, quite often it's the unknowing going to a place and then indulging their unknowingness and opining and reflecting. And look, lots and lots of people are happy to be along for that journey, but I'd much rather be in the company of Richard Rhodes or Apsley Cherry Garrard in Antarctica, who was there on a scientific endeavour, who was there with Scott, who was there and then writes compellingly about why he was there and what they were doing and what it was like. It's not like he decided to go for a trip to Antarctica and then tells you all about what it feels like to be in Antarctica.
It sounds like we're talking about the difference between an internal journey that people do, like the road trip, but it's really all about them and how they're going to change, and the external, the looking outside.
Look, I think it is. You've put your finger on it there. I'm just being polite about it. Look, I enjoyed Jack Kerouac's book, though oddly enough, On the Road, which to some extent I suppose started some of certainly the contemporary travel genre. One of the things fascinating about that is the language. You're there for the language, and for the most popular quote travel books, there's usually something other that's there that's probably made them successful. Bill Bryson is your quintessential travel writer in a lot of people's minds. In fact, he's a really good humorist. You're there for the humour. You're not really there. I don't think you're really there for his travels. P.J. O'Rourke recently passed away, which caused great sadness. I adored his Holidays in Hell, and oddly, it's often cited as travel writing. It's not. It's political essay. Another interesting one as well. I seem to remember, I hope you can correct me if I'm wrong, but I seem to remember reading Robin Davison, an essay by Robin Davison, who of course wrote Tracks. She is often lumped, into the travel writing genre, and she resists it greatly, and probably for some of the reasons that I'm saying. I mean, she went across the landscape, but her endeavour was to travel with camels to some extent. I'm overlapping here, but I find it interesting that even somebody who, in my book, did write a travel book, who is a travel writer of sorts, resists it. It's a genre that's a bit at war with itself, I think.
Can you explain what you mean by that?
There's the example of Davison. I think she never saw herself as a travel writer and resisted it. I think for some of the reasons that I touched on earlier, that it ends up feeling like an indulgence. It ends up feeling like an ego trip. And so you would resist it. I think there's many people out there who would say, no, not a travel writer.
Here's someone that we probably wouldn't think of a travel writer on your top of your list, which is John Steinbeck, Cannery Row.
Definitely not a travel writer. I included him on this in this pile with a couple other fiction writers as well. The other one being Graham Greene. I ended up travelling with both, works from both of these authors. I adore Steinbeck. I absolutely adore him. And I found myself visiting Monterey, not for any reason. And I sort of put the two things together, and I ended up picking up Cannery Row. And, it's some of the most beautiful and evocative prose on place. But just writing well about place, it doesn't make you a travel book. Place should be something that can be brought to a book to tremendous effect. And Steinbeck was all over that. The environment, the town of Cannery Row, it informs his character. It informs the fabric of life in Cannery Row. It informs the time. It informs the dialogue. It's, and it all comes together in something tremendously satisfying.
I guess what you get there is you get a fantastic, as you say, sense of place, but you get a story as well.
Yeah, it's got a purpose. And the purpose here is for Steinbeck to take the men, mostly the men that he grew up with, and bring them to his novel and give them heart and soul and life. But they're also in this place that is brilliantly brought to the page.
Now, you've done more than just read these books and go to the same places. You've kind of got rather involved in the whole event. And Papillon, I noticed sitting there, the great story of its time, there's got a bit of a story for you behind it.
Okay, it has actually, and interestingly, Papillon is one that falls into a really weird category of fiction and non-fiction. Henri Charrier most certainly fabricated a great deal of it, but I read the book like millions did. It was a tremendous bestseller in the 1970s when it was released, and for very good reason as well. Henri Charrier was sent to the appalling penal colony that France kept in French Guiana. I really immersed myself in his pages and ended up trying to follow as many footsteps as he had left behind. And it was surprising how many footsteps I was able to find. Although most of those footsteps, though they were committed to his pages, they belonged to other people. They were not his footsteps.
When you say footsteps, what do you mean by that?
Oh, figuratively speaking, he leaves a trail in the pages. When he's at Kourou, or when he's in the capital, or when he's in the penal colony itself, and the many breakouts that he tells. Pigeon Island, I seem to remember, which was, if I remember correctly, was supposed to be the leper colony. Anyway, you can end up following the breadcrumbs that he leaves in his pages, and sure enough, there was a leper colony on Pigeon Island, and you start breaking apart the truth of the matter, the history of the thing, and you start putting together the Papillon's truth. Interestingly, I got very obsessed with trying to get on to Devil's Island, made famous by the book, made famous by the film, I should also add. And oddly, I ended up getting arrested trying to get onto the island. I got a bit desperate, and I persuaded a yacht owner to sail me over. He took the yacht, actually quite within his right to do it, but the yacht did not belong to him. We were about 1 kilometre from the island, like right up against it, and a French police helicopter hovered overhead, settled on us, blew the yacht over, sort of just try and stop us in our tracks. And then the loudspeaker came over, said, "Go back to the mainland, you're under arrest for the theft of a boat," and we were all put in the slammer for a night.
So you ended up in the middle of your own adventure.
Yeah, and look, it's like when you do travel, it's down to you to immerse or embark on sort of your own journeys, and the extent to that you want to do that is all down to you. Perhaps one of the most interesting crossovers that I had. I went to Haiti, and I read The Comedians by Graham Greene, which if you're familiar with Greene's work, a lot of guilt, a lot of tortured white men in situations where they're trying to basically coordinate and coerce the local populations. There's a character in The Comedians called Petit Pierre, and he's a journalist in the book. Greene obviously knew Haiti and had lived there, and he'd actually taken a real life character called Oberlin Jolicoeur, which is a wonderful name because I think Jolicoeur means happy heart. Anyway, I met him. The man was still alive, and I met him, and I had my copy of The Comedians with me, and I was sat, not only having been intimately immersed in these pages, I was talking to a character off the pages. I think I'd gone to the 5th dimension by then, but I'll just show you the inside of the cover. So obviously I had my book with me. So that is there's a photograph there of Mr. Jolicoeur.
He really looks the part, doesn't he?
He was a notorious flatterer. He was involved with the Duvalier regime, and he would basically put happy spins on everything that was going on with Papa Doc. Look, he lived between, I think he probably trod a line between life and death, and using his wily character managed to stay alive. But he also signed my copy of the... He signed my diary, the diary that I'd been keeping while I was on there. And it was a lovely inscription, so it's something I've sort of treasured ever since. There's the quote, that's him.
Oh. Now, we've just found the quote. Read it out to me.
This gives you an idea. As I say, he was a notorious flatterer, and he occupied that twilight between, the murderous Duvalier on one side and the people and the powers that were on Haiti. To Max Anderson, a new friend because he has drawn the best out of me. From Oberlin Jolicoeur, very impressed by him, March 2000.
Oh, fantastic. What a souvenir.
It is extraordinary. Yeah. I'm very lucky to have it. And look at the state of the copy. Look, I've got the terrible habit of making little tears in the side of the page so I can reference back to stuff. So I've got this dreadful old copy of The Comedians signed by one of the characters.
Travel writer Max Anderson. We were sitting at his kitchen table in front of an amazing pile of books. I wanted to immediately borrow them all. Check out our Facebook page to see that pile, and also a photograph of Oberlin Jolicoeur, that Graham Greene character that Max met on his travels in Greene's footsteps.
This is Sundoku, the podcast for rusted-on readers.
Hi, I'm Belinda. I am in my mid to late 50s. As a child, I really did not read very much at all. I can remember a book called Shadow the Sheepdog, and that was my first book that I ever really got into and enjoyed. But, when you have to read those books at school for English, I never enjoyed that. Through my 20s and 30s, occasionally I would get a book and I just would love to read it. But only occasionally, and I have to say the Harry Potter book, I read them from beginning to end and I really, really enjoyed them, and they prompted my interest in books. And then I joined a book club and my interest in books increased, and I got to read lots of different styles of books. My favourite book that I have read lately has been Honeybee by Craig Silvey. That's a book about a transgender teenager searching for love and self-acceptance. And I thought the words that Craig used were just beautiful, and you didn't know where it was going, but it was just wonderful to see his life improved by love, support, acceptance and understanding. And I thought it was a really good book and I adored it. In the pile of books beside my bed, I've got Hannah Kent's Devotion, Hanya Yanagihara, To Paradise, and We Are All Birds of Uganda by Hatsa Zayan.
We love to hear from random readers, and we'd love to hear from you.
If you're keen to share your habits and reading past and give us a glimpse of your sundoku, send us a voice memo to sundokocast@gmail.com. Thanks for joining Sundoku. I'm Annie Hastwell.
And I'm Kath Keneally. Catch you next time.
This podcast is produced by 4 book addicts refusing treatment.
Kath Keneally.
Michaela Andreev. Sarah Martin.
And me, Annie Hastwell. Our thanks to composer Quincy Grant for the music. If you want to know more about the books and authors featured in this episode, check out the show notes. You can find us on Facebook and Instagram at SundokuCast. That's TSUNDOKU Cast.